Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning in terms of our ABC's webinar, S.O.S, supporting Black-led nonprofits in the age of COVID-19. I am Diane Bell McCoy, President and CEO of Associated Black Charities. This is about providing access by providing golden information, tips for applying for foundation funding. I want to first also make sure I introduce our panelists this morning in terms of what will be their order of presentation discussion. Nicole Johnson, founder, Extraordinary Changes, Inc., and thank you, Nicole, for joining us, along with Talib Horn, Director of Baltimore Civic Site, the Annie Casey Foundation, Darius Graham, Program Director, Baltimore, the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, Natasha Horton, Vice President, Community Development Manager, Sun Trust, Now Truth, Janelle, I knew I was going to do it, Gennaro, Deputy Director, Baltimore's Promise. And I want to also say a very huge thank you and appreciation to our technical support from Digital Harbor Foundation, Andrew and Kenny Clash, and also to my team, Anike Edmonds. Again, thank you this morning for joining us. I look forward to a very enlightened opportunity today to share information. And we also want to make sure we're making time to have questions from you, the audience. This is about your getting the information you need today. I want to first give a little bit of housekeeping information for everyone, that our tech support actually have the ABC logo, the starburst you'll see there, and that they'll be available if you have some tech issues, but also that when we go to the open questions, we're going to ask you to use the box at the bottom in terms of the Q&A. The chat box at the bottom is really limited to sending a message to panelists, but we're going to ask you your questions to go in the Q&A. And Anike will be assisting us to make sure your questions get to the panelists this morning, and that we want to go through our presentation first this morning from our panelists, and they both in terms of got powerful PowerPoint presentations for you for two of them, and then powerful answers from all the panelists today about what they do and how to gain relationships in that philanthropic world. We want to do that first. Want to also make sure that you know that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted later to ABC's website. So as I heard on a webinar yesterday, if you have problems with the recorded webinar, please exit now because we need to identify to you that we are recording. And I believe you will be on mute until the questions and answer portion of the webinar begins. Before we begin with our panelists jumping in first, which we'll be starting with Nicole, I wanted to frame today's webinar, particularly from a perspective of ABC and why this is so important to us. Our agenda is about closing the racial wealth gap in Baltimore. And that is about both doing things short term and helping Black workers, but it's also about how do we change the system. What COVID-19 has really revealed for all of us is the racial inequities that exist in our system. And that's been what we've talked about probably for the last 5 years, in helping people understand it's also those inequities in systems in terms of racialized challenges that are often just unknown sometimes in systems, but negative outcomes for people of color clearly are not necessarily unknown for people of color. And so very recent headline in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, dated May 7th, what headline was, "Nonprofits led by people of color win less grant money with more strings." It goes on to indicate that organizations led by people of color win less grant money and are trusted less to make decisions about how to spend those funds than groups with white leaders, according to this new report. That report was done by consultancy Bridgespan and Echoing Green, an organization that invests in and provides support for leaders of emerging social enterprises. It's important to know the report goes on to describe the actual financial gap of support for organizations led by people of color than white-led organizations. White-led groups had budgets that were 24% larger than those led by people of color. White-led organizations had budgets that were 24,000 larger than those 24,000% larger than those led by people of color. Organizations led by Black women, this is interesting, received less funding than those led by Black men or white women. And even when those same nonprofits were focused on similar issues, the gaps were even larger. This is important about data, as we've seen the health disparities with COVID-19. Data is critical to help us understand and change these systems. I do believe that we're at a point now in this country where we know and we need to change systems. The study goes on to further elaborate on the racial composition of the foundation world, both in its leadership as well as its staff. It makes it clear kind of the concise point about the role of relationships. We did a webinar yesterday for Black businesses and that whole issue of access and relationships to banks. Social capital is absolutely gold capital in terms of being able to make that difference connect. The study talks about personal relationships are essential to securing funding, and it notes the differences makes and can make when a foundation has more talent of color who are often more tuned to building relationships with leaders on the ground. ABC did a report also in 2008, which actually talks about a very extensive review of that issue of social capital for people of color and how that's limited and why that's limited from a racialized challenge in terms of systems that limit some of that. We also know that given that reality that we're facing today, the impact of these structural racialized challenges, systems, racialized challenges in our country really do lead us very much to where we are today. And we know that going forward, we cannot go forward this way. Our goal is how do we give you access to information as one of the things that we do, because we know that even the local Baltimore community wants things to be different and that many of them are working to make that difference. We want to be a part of helping to make that difference in terms of, and we know that in terms of the middle of the pandemic, Black-led organizations, in particular smaller, grassroots, were often left out in terms of, we know that true for business, and as much as funders want to reach out, sometimes that information and connection just isn't there in terms of that. So we want to use today and future the opportunities to make that connection, to give you information that you can use in making the connection. Because what we all want is a different set of outcomes, positive outcomes for children, for families, for adults in this city. Because when we all benefit economically, we all benefit. And so that's what this is about today. I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to turn it over to Nicole in terms of let Nicole move forward in terms of her PowerPoint presentation. And if you can hold your questions and that until, again, at the end, I'll open it back up for questions after all the panelists have presented. Nicole.
Thank you, Diane. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you today. The information I'm presenting is based upon my experience as both a grant writer and a reviewer of grants for foundations and government agencies. And as I present, just a reminder, please write any questions or comments that you have in the chat or in the Q&A. All right, next slide. Dismantling racism, removing the hardships caused by unemployment or lack of access to health care, supporting our neighbors to manage during the COVID-19 pandemic. None of this work can be done by an individual organization working alone. We need partners and allies to work together to make a difference. Next slide. Grant writing is a call to action. With each grant proposal you write, you are inviting donors to join with you to make the community a better place. Your proposal may be your first and only chance to tell your story and help a funder understand how your organization and its work is going to make an impact. Next slide. What follows during this presentation are recommendations to address 5 common mistakes folks make when writing grants. Ignoring the instructions outlined in the RFP, too many misspelled words and grammar mistakes, promising to solve all of the community's problems, proposing more than your organization can reasonably do, confusing a big vision with concrete goals and outcomes, and lastly, errors in the budget. Numbers don't add up or your assumptions just don't make sense. I've tailored the information in this presentation to prepare you for your application to the COVID-19 Response Funding Collaborative RFP. Next slide. So first, pay attention to the RFP guidelines. Make sure you meet the funding priorities and the geographic area described in the RFP. If your activities or neighborhoods served don't match these requirements, you are not eligible. In a competitive grant process, organizations with more direct connection to these priorities will get priority by funders. In addition, submit all of the required documents. They can take time to pull together. If you wait to the last minute, you may miss the deadline. Try your best to submit your application at least 4 hours before the time deadline. Online applications can have glitches. Attachments can take time to upload. Too many visitors to the site and your submission could be delayed. In the case of rolling reviews, such as this RFP, apply early. Make sure funders have time to consider your application. Next slide. Edit the proposal at least 3 times. For online applications, draft your responses and questions to the questions in Word. It's easier to write, read, and edit your answers in Word. You can also track your character limit. Give yourself a few characters to spare. Once you've drafted your answers, do a thorough grammar check. Misspelled or misused words can make the application hard to read. It shows a lack of attention to detail. If editing isn't your strength, try an online tool like Grammarly to help you catch the most obvious errors. Like spell check, though, any online grammar tool is not perfect. Before you copy and paste your responses to the online application, have at least one other person review your work. They can read for grammar, but they can also tell you if what you've written makes sense. Did you actually answer the question? Next slide. State your difference made. In your response, focus on the change you are trying to make. In a clear and concise way, answer these questions. Who will be better off because of your work? How will they be better off? What is your contribution to that better off? How will your work take advantage of any assets in the community? And how will it remove barriers? Next slide. Define measurable goals, objectives, or outcomes. You want to prioritize the indicators that mean the most to your organization. You will want to make sure you can reasonably track and collect data to measure those indicators. Describe your strategy so that funders understand how many people you're going to serve, how many hours or meetings you're going to have, and what quality looks like. What will it mean to you? Like, how will you measure whether or not folks value what you have to give? And then lastly, how will you know that your target population is better off? What's your ultimate difference made? And lastly, you want to get the timing right. You want to outline your impact in terms of short-term and long-term goals and objectives. Next slide. Edit the budget and finance information. Like your answers to the RFP questions, you want to edit the budget to make sure it is clear and accurate. Calculation mistakes or confusing formulas can get in the way of a funder feeling confident about how you will spend the funds or the actual amount of money you need to support your program. I recommend that you draft your budget in Excel or at a minimum use a calculator to double check the numbers. We all make those math mistakes, so you want to make sure you are paying attention to those details. When you start to draft your budget narrative, see this as another opportunity to help donors understand how your program will make a difference. Provide details about how you plan to spend the dollars and if you have other support, money from other donors, in-kind donations, volunteers. Provide as much detail as you can. Next slide. So as you work through your proposal and prepare your application, you want to take your time and really walk through every aspect of the RFP and the online application. Next slide. I've outlined here a few quick action steps you can just sort of check off as you move to submitting your application. First, you want to download or print the PDF of the RFP and the application. You want to read them through page to page, and you want to copy the questions to Word. As I suggested, you want to make sure that you're writing your responses in Word so that you can better edit, and also drafting your budget in Excel so that you can really know if the calculations make sense. Number 4, edit, edit, edit. I can't say this enough. I'm going to say it again before I wrap up. Edit, edit, edit. Make sure that you are, as you copy your answers into the online application, that you've done all you can to be clear, concise, and complete in your responses. Next slide. So as you move through the steps, you want to pay attention to the RFP guidelines. You want to edit at least 3 times, both the narrative and the budget. And then the budget is just as important as the narrative. Don't wait till the last minute to draft your budget and your financial information. You want to make sure that it's accurate and complete. Next slide. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to answering your questions following the other panelists. Thank you.
So remember to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Nicole. This is phenomenal. This is gold, absolute gold for our audience in terms of information. We have more gold to present in terms of a conversation with the rest of our panelists. I'm actually going to pose some questions to Darius and Talib, as well as Natasha. And as I just indicated them in terms of chat, I want to kind of switch it up and ask this question and ask all of them to respond. They really have a wealth of information, and I know that Talib and Darius have an existing relationship in terms of their different respective foundations, and we'll have some answers, but I wanted you to actually hear from all of them and actually even to share information with each other in terms of both Darius, Talib, and Natasha. Just as you answer the question, could you begin by also sharing with our participants your organization, what you do in terms of, because I know for some of the foundations that you don't take applications directly, some do, but declaring that will be helpful for our audience. But the issue that was raised in the study, in terms of it, Nicole gave kind of concrete information, and when Janelle comes up, she'll give more concrete information. And that's an opportunity that's right here and now that really the foundations, the donors in that fund for COVID-19 really want people to respond and apply. That as it goes on through the year in terms of that, the whole issue of does having relationships with staff from the foundation or from the funding opportunity, whether it's foundation or the bank philanthropic side, the relationships matter. And how have you handled that issue of relationships when communities are thinking about gaining access? So if I can ask you all three that question, but if you can begin by also just talking about what your foundation or your organization focused on. And I'll just go to you, Talib, and Darius and Natasha, if you can go on that in terms of answering that question.
Okay, well, thank you, Diane and Nicole. Very good presentation. I'm Talib Horn. I'm the director of the Baltimore Civic Site in Baltimore. KC is a 72-year-old organization. It was created in 1948 by Jim Casey, who was the owner and entrepreneur that created UPS. Casey Foundation actually came to Baltimore in 1994. So we've been in Baltimore for 26 years. The foundation really got additional dollars in 1983 when Jim Casey died. And in his bequest, he gave all of his dollars to really start the Casey Foundation. So for the last 37 years, that's when we really have been actively engaging in sort of national grant making. The reason why Baltimore is significant, one, it's our hometown, but we have two sort of civic sites. One's Baltimore, the other one is Atlanta. I give out close to $6 million a year, primarily focused on three areas. One is economic opportunity, the other one is education, the other one is neighborhood transformation. In terms of the relationship piece, I'll just say a quote. It says, if you want to get advice, ask for money. If you want to get money, ask for advice. And so I think and that's not my quote, that's Scott Spencer's quote. But what I will say, I think it all starts with a conversation. Relationships are key, but what I will say in terms of grassroots, particularly individuals of color, you know your community, you are the experts. And a lot of times in the foundation world, we're looking for that to sort of get on the ground understanding of the current needs. And so I would say the relationship starts with a conversation and the way you tell your story. And then once I think you have a good story to tell, and you come with a question instead of an answer, I think that helps.
Thanks. Talib, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks again. Thanks, Diane and team, for putting this together. And thanks for everyone for joining us on this Friday morning. I will echo a really great presentation, Nicole. So thanks for sharing that information with the audience. I'm Darius Graham. I'm the program director for Baltimore with the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation. So we're a nonprofit foundation, of course, based in the Baltimore area, but we fund in different cities and communities across the country, and including Israel. And our funding focuses on supporting 501c3 organizations that provide direct services to low-income or vulnerable populations in certain communities. So much of our work in Baltimore really runs the gamut. We provide operating support, so that's money that would be given to an organization that they can allocate however they best see fit within their organization. We provide program grants, which are designated for a specific program, so those are restricted grants. And then we also provide a lot of capital grants, so that may be for buying equipment or for renovating, purchasing a building, those sorts of things. So we do all three of those in Baltimore. I'll talk about our traditional process and then a special opportunity that we have, which I will also share the link and information with Diane and put it in the chat window here so you all have it. Our traditional process, as Diane mentioned, we have sort of this hybrid model, so we don't allow really unsolicited proposals. What we ask is that you go on our website, hjweinberg.org, and look at our requirements, look at our funding priorities, and then we ask that you have a conversation with someone on our team first before submitting that first step. Doing that will help make sure that we're on the same page, and that if it is a good fit, you can move forward with the letter of inquiry, that first step. If it's not a good fit, it saves both of us time in this process. So I would say start by looking at the requirements on the website, and then from there having a conversation. So our foundation for our team, we're all listed on our website. Our contact information is there. I believe it gives you email address, phone number. So we're available and accessible to answer questions. We do encourage you, though, to spend some time on there, making sure that what you want to submit a request for is a fit with our priorities. So a couple of things that I did just want to highlight regarding the questions is that on the point of relationships, I think the relationships really are important. But again, I think if you don't have those relationships, that's fine. Again, you have folks like all of us here on the phone and others at foundations who are, accessible and eager to answer whatever questions you have. So even if you don't have a personal relationship with someone at a foundation, feel free to call, feel free to email. If someone emails me or calls, I view it as important to always respond to those. I may not be able to immediately, but at least within a couple days. So I encourage you to reach out to folks. When you do make that initial outreach, whether that's a phone call or an email, for me, I'm easier with email, but I encourage you just to highlight a couple things in that initial outreach. So one would be to demonstrate how your program or organization aligns with the funding priorities of the foundation. So you may say, I am leading a program called Darius's Food Delivery Nonprofit, and we provide access to healthy food for people in certain neighborhoods. And you can say, I see that you all fund these kinds of programs on your website, so show that you have a fit to one of the funding priorities. Also, to something Nicole mentioned, talk about what results you can show. So this can be, some of you may have like very robust data operations and can spit out statistics and percentages and all that. Some of you may have anecdotes or stories. Whatever you have, I'd encourage you just to highlight that. If it's a success story or testimonial that you have, if you have numbers and data, that's helpful as well. And then any other points that can further talk about results. So whether you've gotten funding from other foundations, if you won any awards, if there's been an article about you in the paper or online, you can put a link to that to say, learn more about us here and what we've done. And then if you have a phone call or a meeting with someone from the foundation, then you have an opportunity in person or on the phone to sort of make your pitch. And that's really just, telling that foundation staff person what it is you're working on, what the support is you're seeking, and why it's important, the work that you're doing. In a lot of those conversations, I always encourage people to come to the meeting or come to the phone call with some talking points. So things that you want to highlight, which again would be the fit, the results, the data, that sort of thing. But also be sure that you're allowing time to get to the questions that the foundation person will have for you. Sometimes I get in meetings or phone calls where people are so eager and so passionate, and I love it. and they want to tell me everything about their program. And I'm the kind of person, I'm typically sold in the first minute. I really like everything. Anyone trying to improve their community, I'm a fan of that. But I will have more questions because I know that my team and our leadership who approves grants will have questions. So just make sure that as you're pitching and trying to sell what you're doing, that you're also allowing time for the questions that the other person may have as well. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I look forward to the questions that you all may have. And I'm going to share the link to a special program we have called the Baltimore City Community Grants Program, which is an open application process for organizations that have under $500,000 a year budgets. So I'll share that link in the chat window.
So good morning, everyone. I am Natasha Horton. I am the Community Development Manager for Truist. If you guys are not aware, BB&T and SunTrust merged last year and created a new entity, which is Truist Bank. Out of that entity, we also recently created our Truist Foundation. Under our foundation, we inspire and build communities through our 4 pillars. And we have 4 pillars that we know will actually meet the needs of our communities. One is thriving communities, economic mobility, leadership development, and educational equity. And those are the 4 pillars that we focus on. We do not give funds for general operating. We only provide funds for one-time needs. We also do not make multi-year grants. We only focus, again, on one-time needs. And a one-time need would possibly be a new curriculum, a virtual training program for underserved community. You're building a park in a new community. Those things are one-time needs. And one of the things that I find is that most of the not-for-profits really don't understand the new Truist Foundation. So we will be coming out, hopefully partnering with Diane over the summer, really explaining how individuals can apply for our funding. I believe a relationship is important, but it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to have one. I think Nicole summed it up best during her presentation. It's very impactful for you, one, to read and understand exactly what the foundation is asking of you, making sure that your budget is in alignment with your ask. And those are the 2 things that I find that sometimes are missing. Errors or the language is not gelling, you will automatically get declined. We make local, I am the co-chair of our local foundation, and our foundation is in Charlotte, and we actually send all of our requests to the foundation in Charlotte for final approval. They normally approve everything that we send to them. But again, if you have spelling errors, you're not actually meeting our pillars, you will automatically get denied. So I am happy that we're having this conversation. I think it will definitely be impactful for you. And I look forward to your questions later on. I'll turn it back over to Diane.
Thank you. Thank you, all 3 of you. What I realized we have heard you this morning in terms of the points that you've offered and even your availability to have the conversations directly with the community, and also having people understand their priority, and also kind of emphasizing the very points that Nicole raised in terms of our PowerPoint presentation. But also I'm clear as I listened to you this morning that guys, we're going to have to do this again. This is simply not enough time in terms of what's likely to be a number of our questions that will come and the wealth of the information that you're offering. I had thought of a lot of questions more that I want to ask you in terms of that, but I want to make sure that we make time, because particularly knowing that there's a deadline coming up as it relates to the emergency funding COVID-19, I want to make sure that Janelle has enough time to do her PowerPoint presentation, as well as although the summer collaborative is not open, but to share that information. And before I turn it over to Janelle, I just want to add one other point. We laid out at the beginning that information from the national study, and our agenda is around how do we dismantle structural racism in the systems that keep people of color in terms of accessing the opportunity and making a difference. It really is about equity in terms of, and again, I repeat, it's about equity as it relates to the total outcome for this country, and certainly for Baltimore is our focus in terms of changing those economic outcomes. When we change those economic outcomes for people of color, all those roads ultimately lead to a better economic outcome for everybody. And we're not quite sure why people don't get that yet, but that's a conversation for another day. I will say, I'm pleased to say part of what I would consider some of our influence in the Baltimore market has been in terms of a lot of the equity conversations that are going on inside of a number of the organizations that are sitting on this panel. In terms of, Casey is always, I guess, moved into an equity framework years ago, to everybody know that, and actually has a frame of equity and gone deeper even around the equity framework, both for the organization and as you look outward in terms of that. And so they continue to grow in that space and make that a part of the agenda. They fund us for some of our equity work in that workforce ecosystem. And I'm excited about the work that Weinberg's doing in terms of beginning to look at that differently, particularly the conversations in terms of that I've had with Rachel in terms of the president over the years, and excited in that at one, people think about a Jewish organization, will that not understand needs for people of color? And it's exciting to me to share that actually Weinberg intentionally with Rachel's leadership went after nationally to search for a Jewish African-American board member, a trustee, and actually there is one on the foundation, and began to also look for an entire organization, beginning this journey around understanding structural racism, understanding equity in terms of kind of foundation-wide, and I know that's a continued journey for Weinberg Foundation. And I know we've had that conversation in terms of lots of that with beginning to have it with even SunTrust and Truist in terms of how do we help you begin to think about this from a more racial equity framework. So as I turn it over to Janelle, I will also say I absolutely love Baltimore's Promise and have to declare in terms of disclose, I'm a board member in terms of Baltimore's Promise. And as we began, I guess it's like almost 3 years ago, we really pushed hard at the table for Baltimore's Promise about making sure they understood equity, understood they had to have an equity frame. It's something that the team at Baltimore's Promise worked very hard to do. The board has continued to grow in that space. And so that for me is a big part of that journey in terms of we don't get to the ultimate equity outcomes and dismantling this until a period of time. And it's a continuous journey. Well, I'll talk in a little bit about a tool that we have around this whole issue of equity and this whole issue around just having philanthropic organizations understand and begin to frame this around equity, racial equity, in terms of our policy and practice and grant making. In terms of that. So we're pleased to announce that tool. We'll talk about it later, but I want to turn it over to Janelle in terms of give you some powerful information.
Great. Thank you, Diane. Thank you for that warm welcome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Janelle Gindrano, and I'm the Deputy Director of a local collective impact organization called Baltimore's Promise. Our goal is really to improve outcomes for all of Baltimore City's young people, 0 to 24 at a population level. And so we have a lot of different types of work that we do, but I'm here to talk about specifically 2 funding opportunities for which we serve as the administrative backbone. One which is currently open, which is what we're going to start with, the COVID-19 Response Funding Collaborative of Greater Baltimore, and then one that Diane mentioned, the Summer Funding Collaborative, which I'll refer to as SFC, and that opens in the fall. But I thought it would be important to orient you to that information if you haven't seen it, so you can prepare for when that application opens. So I believe we're going to go into a general Q&A session for audience members after the presentation, so feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A box if you have them. Next slide, please. So this is just a general overview of that first opportunity, the COVID-19 Response Funding Collaborative of Greater Baltimore. Talib and Darius, but representing both of their organizations, are members of this collaborative. And essentially, funders in Greater Baltimore really trying to work together to streamline an application process for nonprofits to have one single point of entry to apply for funding, given all of the operational changes that have been happening as a result of COVID-19. So Baltimore's Promise, we are the administrative backbone. We are not grant makers, decision makers in that regard, but we are supporting the process, making sure the trains run on time, the application is open, the review process is underway. So important to note, this application closes next Friday, May 29th, 2020. All of the application is pretty short, but I just want to highlight that for you since that gives you about a week to work on it if you have not already applied. Next slide, please. This is just the participating funders. We do have a few other funders who are not named here, but that are working in the background to make sure that there's additional funding in this process. Next slide. So these are the geographic areas that this funding can cover. If you do select Baltimore City as an area that your proposal would like to serve, we do ask for neighborhood level and community level information, so we have a sense of what communities funding would serve. Next slide. So these are the grant-making priorities. There are a bunch. I'll just read them out for you all. So access to food. So proposals supporting access to other home essentials is listed here. Nonprofit sustainability, improving the technology and capacity of nonprofits during this time. Mental health and community coping, support for first responders and healthcare workers. Information and credible information sources. And we get a lot of questions about that, but that's essentially ensuring that information that is accurate about how to stop the spread of COVID-19, where it comes from, what people can do to keep themselves safe, are reaching communities that may not be getting regular access to that kind of information. And finally, access to temporary shelter. And those are just at a glance highlight. I would recommend going to the site linked here, the Greater Baltimore COVID Response.org site to see the full descriptions of each. Next slide, please. So these are the eligibility requirements. It's open to nonprofit organizations. If your organization is interested in applying, serves in your community, but you're not a nonprofit, you could work with a fiscal agent that is a nonprofit to apply. You would need to provide a copy of some of the financial documents listed here, depending on your organizational size, and also a certificate of good standing in the state of Maryland. Next slide, please. Okay, so real quick, individuals are not eligible to apply for funding to meet their individual needs. Just want to say that up front. And also you can apply twice, up to twice. If you're a fiscal agent though, you can apply more than that since you're representing other organizations. Next slide. And so we are reviewing on a rolling basis. We're trying to get word out to folks as quickly as possible. We continue, even if, during a particular review, an application doesn't receive funding at that time, we keep them in our pool since we're constantly trying to get more funding to support this effort. And so just want to let you know, we're working hard in that regard. There's no maximum request cap, but generally you'll find awards so the 10 to 25,000 range, and most requests generally are not exceeding $75,000. And so as I mentioned earlier, the application is going to be closing on May 29th, which is next Friday, so it's really important to know. Oh, next slide, please. Yep, so if you have any questions, please feel free to send them out to the address listed here. Also, I'm not sure if my email address is shared as a part of the webinar information, but you're also welcome to email me directly, Janelle@baltimorespromise.org. So I think we can go over to the next funding opportunity. I'm trying to be speedy so we have time for questions, but we can move on to the next slide. So this opportunity is not currently open, but it will be opening in the fall. So I wanted to make sure that we gave some information about the Baltimore Summer Funding Collaborative. So we can go to the next slide. And this is just a general overview of the Summer Funding Collaborative. It's a partnership of over 10 different types of funding organizations, public, private, and nonprofits, with a shared goal to support high quality summer programs for kids in Baltimore City. Next slide, please. So what are the goals of the Summer Funding Collaborative? Why are they all working together? So really coordinate funding and maximize the number of summer opportunities that are available. Also, prior to the Summer Funding Collaborative existing, if you were a summer program looking for funding, you would have to send, 5, 10, 15 different applications to different funders and different portals with different expectations. It is really a huge burden. So it's really to coordinate a process similar to the last funding opportunity I talked about, and have a single point of entry for organizations. So it's less of a burden on organizations to apply. Also through this process, we collect data centrally, and that helps us coordinate other related resources related to the summer system in Baltimore City. Next slide, please. So these are the current funding partners. This list has remained more or less the same across the last 2 or 3 years, but I think what's important to take away here is you can see a mix of private sector, public, and philanthropic funding represented here. Next slide. So what is Baltimore SPOMIS doing in the Summer Funding Collaborative? So similar to the last funding effort, we are the administrative backbone. So we are not a funder and decision maker in that regard. We make sure the trains run on time, and we coordinate all of the functions you see listed here, including professional development for grantees, networking events so organizations can work with each other and spark ideas for collaboration, making sure there are youth involved in the review process for applications, etc. Next slide, please. So this slide, I included it here just to give you a sense of the volume of grant making each year and how competitive the grant opportunity is. So if you want to just focus on 2019, so that year, the Summer Funding Collaborative was able to fund a little over 1/3 of the amount of requested proposals and less than half of the program models that applied. But the grantees range in size from really small community-based programs serving 10 young people, 15 young people, 20 young people, to larger scale programs that are serving hundreds across the city. So you'll see a pretty diverse grant pool in terms of like program model size and what they focus on, funded through the Summer Funding Collaborative. Next slide. So big caveat highlighted in yellow. So the application is currently closed. I believe you can still click on that link to take you, so you can familiarize yourself with the question from the application that we issued this past fall. But I wanted to just share this information with you, but also just note that you wouldn't be able to apply right now. So in general, it needs to be a nonprofit organization, and you must serve young people located in Baltimore City. And if you're running for more than 4 hours a day, making sure that they are fed during that day with healthy meals. And so this summer is going to be a little tricky, right? Because we're not really sure to what extent, if any, summer programs can operate in person, probably likely not, but we're working with the grantees that we funded through this last cycle to figure all that out. But generally, in normal times, this would be the expectation. Next slide, please. So the Summer Funding Collaborative, there are a number of funders involved, but it is not a funding pool. So every funder has different funding priorities specific to their organization and their organization's missions. However, there are 3 shared priorities that all funders participating share. So programs should be operating for at least 2 years. However, if you're a youth serving program that has a history of working with young people, just not in the form of a summer program, you'd still be eligible to apply, and there's a space for you to talk about the work that you've done working with young people. The second is programs must work to promote academic and social emotional growth in participants. That's not to say it needs to look like school, but there needs to be some sort of like academic and social emotional enrichment component in order for your proposal to be competitive at the Summer Funding Collaborative. Finally, programs need to welcome students of all abilities. Next slide, please. So how does SFC work after the decisions? These are some of the expectations that we have for programs funded through the collaborative. So there's 1 site visit. It's coordinated centrally by us, so you don't have, if you have multiple funders, you don't have like 5 different site visits. We try and make sure it's not burdensome to programs, so we get a nice check-in on how the summer's going. We also ask that providers issue youth surveys. So it's a way for us, the Summer Funding Collaborative, to know how our youth are feeling about programs. And this information actually really helps us as we think through professional development for programs in the following year, and also helps us think about whether our funding priorities are right. Finally, the end of summer report. So I think this is a big benefit compared to life before the SFC. So rather than having to submit 1 report for every single different funder that you may be funded by for your program, it's just 1 shared centralized report that you would have to submit if you are funded. Next slide, please. So this is a draft timeline. We haven't actually finalized the timeline for this upcoming cycle, so I don't have exact sort of ranges. This is based on last year. There's a big caveat there. Just want to be really transparent about that. However, I would encourage you to look at the Summer Funding Collaborative website for updates. That's the central place where you're going to get the most up-to-date information about our process. But based on last year, we opened the application in October, and we ran, I think, 3 or 4 like information sessions. Some people call them bidders conferences, to let people ask whatever questions they have about the process or the application. We compile all of the questions we receive in person or by email into one centralized Q&A document, and we post it so everyone has the same access to information that everybody else has. And then we, in mid-November, or late November, I should say, the RFP closes. We try to keep the application open for a month. It's a pretty long application, but it's only one application, so that's the plus. So it'll close based on last year's timeline, late November. And then there is some work that goes into finalizing those decisions. And that includes like youth review processes to make sure young people have their eyes on the applications and are informing the decision-making process. So the decisions came out February of last year. And I think the timeline should be around the same, but I would check back in on the SFC website for full details in like a month or two. Next slide, please. So my colleague Jasmine, she's off today, but she is really the heart and soul of the Summer Funding Collaborative, making sure everything runs. This is her contact information. You could send any questions you have after this webinar, about the process to that email address, and she'll be sure to get back to you and keep you on the listserv so you can be there, to get the email when the RFP launches for next year. So I think that's all there is on my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I want to just begin to open up, and I'm going to ask Anika in terms of to bring the questions forward to the panel. I want to make a couple of remarks, though, just before we move into the questions, because I know there's a wealth of them. I just want to say how we got to doing this webinar today for ABC, particularly given the issue of COVID-19 and being very real in all of our lives right now. It wasn't just the article in terms of that was kind of a calling card, but again, what we know around the challenges of getting access. And it is not that any of the funders around this table don't want to give access to communities of color. I would say everybody around this table does in terms of that. But I think it's also we all, in terms of how do we reach out, how do we find the different relationships, the different pathways in terms of increasing those access points. And as this article came out, I reached out to a number of the foundations, and I was doing my usual Diane fussing about why don't we do more and what can we do more of. And I realized, okay, you got to stop fussing. One of the things I recently also pushed around is particularly communities of color. We also have particularly Black community, have ability to be a part of our own solution. And part of being our own solution for me is sharing information. And so with that said, I felt like, okay, we've got to get this information out. We have a responsibility. So although that deadline is next Friday in terms of for the COVID-19 collaborative, it has been out for a while, we realized that we needed to get the information out, even though it's next Friday. Anytime any other information comes up for opportunity for funding, we're going to figure out a way to get it out. We'll get it on our website. Our team has been working fiercely to gather information about resources, particularly for people of color and COVID-19. We're going to keep, whether it's business that, we're going to keep moving that information on our website. This is not what we're funded for, and so we don't have the ability to do this ongoing oftentimes, and what we would like to do is more of a TA for communities of color to make sure you can get to that. But in the meantime, we can do exactly what we're doing, and that is to make sure you've got the information. As quickly as we can get it, we'll post it so that you can access that. So I ask you to stay tuned to our website. As opportunities come up, we're going to put that information out there for you. That's a critical part, I believe, it's our responsibility. If we're talking about changing access, then we got to make sure we give that information as a part of it. To the extent that we can connect you to TA resources that already exist, we're going to do that as well. That's a part of our responsibility, part of our mission in terms of closing the racial wealth gap in this community. The other piece I want to end on in terms of, as we open it for questions though, is now I want to talk about Baltimore's promise. I said at the beginning the issue of data is important. I know that all the foundations collect data. I know that's a big part of what gets collected. Part of the COVID-19 funding in terms of being available, they're actually collecting data. They're collecting data about who gets funded, Black-led organizations or not, in terms of that, rather than that. And so that's a part of what I know they will look at their analysis later in terms of who got funded, how much they get funded, because that's the only way we can also begin to change it. As we know from the health disparity, until that lifted up for the world to see in terms of larger people of color were impacted, that there's not a way to begin to change. But data and data collection is a big part of who Baltimore's promise is, because they understand that what this Baltimore community is like in terms of majority, in terms of people, Black people. and send other people of color. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Anike to say if you want to raise any questions for the panelists that are coming from. Yes, Anike is texting. We can move to the questions. Anike, you've got it.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I just want to say 2 quick notes. Someone did ask about the article that you referenced that's in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. So in the chat window, I put a link to that article. Darius also put the link to the funding opportunity for Weinberg. So people should check the chat window. I've also been asked to make sure we have some part of the slides available from Janelle and Nicole. So I will check with you guys so that I can forward that to attendees. Everyone that registered will get that. So first question that we have, Talib and Darius and Natasha, I think you all can handle this one. What are you all doing at your organizations as program officers and people that review funding applications to really help move that needle on funding, reaching organizations led by people of color?
Well, I can start that. Right after the unrest, OSI put out an interesting report about sort of the disconnect of the funding as it related to a response after Freddie Gray that went to organizations that are run by people of color, particularly young people of color. I think it was less than 5%. And so after that, Casey Foundation, we created a program called the Emerging Leaders Program. And that's looking at a year-long program in partnership with Community Wealth Partners, where we select 17 organizations to take them through a program where they're learning about board cultivation, they're learning about measurements and outcomes. And so we focus on that to build capacity. The second thing that we did as a response to COVID-19 is we gave money to Collectively, and they have a Baltimore Black-led COVID-19 response fund, and that gives micro grants specifically to Black-led organizations. And then the last piece that we did is for organizations that graduated through our program, we allocated $50,000 of emergency funding for those organizations. Those are organizations like the B.org, Young Kings Leadership Academy, Mom Cares, Mentoring Mentors, and Baltimore 360. So that's just some examples. It's not enough, but at least it's a start and a commitment for Casey.
Okay, and Darius or Natasha, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Being a newly formed institution, we actually have started, this summer was actually supposed to be, we were hosting community meetings with our not-for-profits, our women-owned or minority-based not-for-profits. We still will move forward. We hopefully will be partnering with ABC to do that, where we will actually hear feedback from you. We'll be creating panels. We'll be creating community advisory boards that we will host twice a year, where we talk about community needs and also funding. So that's one of the things we are doing. We also created an in-house business resource group for African Americans. And we actually just rolled that out last week. So I'm in the process with Eric Thompson, one of our community leaders, to engage our minority partners in the community. So we're starting. Of course, it's not enough. I think partnering with ABC and other like-minded organizations, Truist definitely will be at the forefront of hopefully bridging the gap.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. For us, what we're doing is constantly looking at our processes and eligibility requirements and making any changes there where we can. For example, we typically require 2 years of audited financials in order to apply for a grant, and we know that for a lot of organizations, that's just not feasible. So that's why we have a program like the Baltimore Community Grants Program and some other opportunities where we still require budget and other financial information, but we won't say you have to have 2 years of audits because we know everyone can do that. So for us, we're currently looking at some of our processes and how we can change some of those.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. Another question, this is more a detailed question. We talked about you don't always have to have the relationships, but you guys gave great tips on building it, how you should reach out and get maybe the first conversation, the first meeting before submitting your application. On the other side, people have asked, what happens if I do end up getting denied? What is the best way for me to ask for feedback from my, the project coordinator or the grant officer, and how should we go about reapplying?
Can I answer this question? This is Natasha. One of the at Truist, we have a person that actually monitors the Truist Foundation email. So if you do receive a decline letter, you can actually email them and ask to speak directly to one of the foundation members, and that person will walk you through the process of why you were denied and what you need to look forward to, or basically how to revamp your application to reapply. I can tell you guys now, under the Truist Foundation, we only meet twice a year. So the first deadline for us has already passed, which was March 31st. And our upcoming deadline is July 31st. I'm pretty sure the panel will put out my information. You are more than happy to reach out to me via email. Most do. And I will provide you with guidance, but also go to our website and make sure you read all of the different pillars, make sure that your budgets are in line. And if you have any additional questions, either reach out to the email link or you can email the individual directly for your county or state.
Yeah, my response would be similar as to when you get a formal notification, whether it's typically an email or a letter saying that you were declined, you can just reply to that by email and ask specifically for any feedback on why it was declined. I will say that for our process, like I mentioned, we require that you speak to someone on our team first, just to make sure there is a good fit and that you have sort of all the things that we would need to consider for the grant. So we do make declines, but what we try to do is have that conversation up front so you don't work your way through the process and then get sort of a surprise decline at the end. So you may have a conversation with myself or someone on the team that I'm on that may say, now is not the right time for you to apply, and we can be specific about why that might be. But in any case, I would encourage you, whether it's about a decline or whatever question you have, is to reach out and always ask for whatever that may be.
To leave, it looked like, oh, there you go.
Yeah, I was on mute. Sorry. For Casey, we are unique in nature, so we don't accept sort of unsolicited proposals. So the majority of times, when by the time it gets to proposal stage, it's a co-creation with one of our program officers. So very rarely do we decline. However, we do have an RFP process for our economic opportunity portfolio. And in that case, if you get a decline, I would just follow up with our program officer for that particular strategy.
Okay, great. And sort of just to piggyback on that a little bit, totally understand that when you're working with a team member, it definitely increases your likelihood of getting an acceptance for that grant. We have a question about, so what if, technically my application looks great and, so does everyone else's, other than, and we all meet your priorities, what would be something, what's the deciding factor that can put me over the top then when, we all have the same GPA and extracurricular activities on our application?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean,
Tough one.
yeah, no, that's a tough one and a really good question. We have, if you are getting to the stage with us of submitting an application, then that means you are a fit, you meet the eligibility requirements, but there may be other things that come up in the review. The other thing I will say is that even for collectively all the folks on this webinar for the grants that we give out, we certainly receive more than we can support. And I would say even more that are, what was the term, technically perfect. than we could even fund. And maybe Janelle can chime in on that, because I know Summer Funding Collaborative, the COVID Collaborative, there are a lot of what I would say are great proposals doing great work that unfortunately don't get funded. I will say in my case, there may be things where if there were two that are equally great, we may sort of opt to go with an organization that may be working with more partners, or maybe working in a certain geography, or maybe we supported a capital project for them, so we want to support their program that's in the building. So there may be a lot of internal factors that don't just relate to what's written on paper.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Tali.
I'm sorry, Janelle, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I was just thinking about this from the perspective of the Summer Funding Collaborative proposal, and that's actually one of the reasons why I shared that SFC by the numbers slide, where you could see the different columns of like the requests and how many proposals come in. I mean, I think that that is the case for the Summer Funding Collaborative. We do give feedback. It's not feedback from specific funders. As I mentioned before, each of the funders have their own decision-making processes, but they get all of the same information, including youth review information. So we give feedback from the youth review portion of that, just responding to the past question. But in general, about this, technically perfect proposal piece, like we do get a lot. You can see that we're only able to fund just a little bit over a third of the total amount of requests in 2019. So I think it's just, it's funding decisions made in context that the applicants don't always have all of the pieces at the time of applying. And so we do our best on the back end to share that information as transparently as possible with folks, so they can see, why that could be the case. And in our feedback sessions, we do say this was a really strong application. It was considered by a number of funders. It really met the eligibility requirements for multiple funders, and programs like yours represented $3 million of requests, like that sort of thing. So we do try and communicate that. Unfortunately, I don't have the magic bullet answer around the decisive factor, because I really do think, decisions are really made in context, and there are just a lot of different factors that are not even related to the proposal that go into the decision-making process for different funders.
I was just going to say really brief. I think the sort of confronting the brutal facts, that's the first thing, that the majority of time you apply, the chances are you might not succeed, but what you're doing is you're planting the seed of your story, you're planting the seed of a potential relationship. And so, just with this COVID experience, there are a lot of organizations who did not get funded, but their name came up. And even though they didn't get funded, there was a long conversation of, do you know this organization? Do you know this? Well, I didn't know that. And so even if they did not get funded for that opportunity, your name's out there and it's exposure for you. A lot of times when it comes to us, it's just timing and allocation of resources. You might just come in when we only have a small amount of money and we've already made commitments. So it's not about how great your proposal was, because it was great. It was just we don't have the resources, and we'll hold on to that proposal. So when we do have the resources, that will be first in line. So I would just say sometimes a no might be delayed. In terms of, sometimes no's are not denials, they're just delays. And so just, just stick with it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Talib. Nicole, I wanted to come to you because you mentioned for people submitting to make sure they're getting it, edit your grant 3 times and review it and review it and review it. And I've definitely been on the writing side a lot. And you may not have that person to help you, especially if you're the young nonprofit and you are your only employee, at the time. Obviously, we're talking about some organizations with limited budgets. Do you have some places, people that people can go to for that? I don't know, maybe an hourly rate of reviewing my grant, for that technical support that you referenced?
So there's a service online that's relatively free that gives you just basic grammar. It's called Grammarly. It's Grammarly.com. It gives you very basic grammar edits and things like that, just as a resource. I think the other, what I've recommended to folks is that you may have, you know, sometimes people seek a grant writer, but you can't necessarily afford one, but it's easier actually to get someone just to review your grant, something that you've written yourself and you just need eyes on it. So that's something else to sort of, you know, look out for. And if you have grant writers or folks that you've worked with or that folks have referred you to, instead of asking them to write the grant, maybe just ask them to read what you've written and give you feedback on it. The other thing I would say, just a low-cost option, is if you have partners or volunteers that work with your organization, poll them to see if they would be able or willing to just, again, read what you've written and what you've prepared so that you have another eye on your application. Yeah, so those are some ways I think that folks can, like, low cost, no cost ways to get feedback on their proposal.
And I would also add to that, Nicole, this is not something that can be done in every case. And this is not for sort of getting proofreading of your proposal, but sometimes after I have that initial conversation with an organization and the answer is yes, you fit all the eligibility, you can submit that letter of inquiry, which is that first step. They may say, well, can I, you know, write that up and email it to you first so you can take a look at it and let you know if I'm on the right track. No, I'm not going to proofread it. I'm not going to edit it. I'm probably not even going to do comments or track changes, but I will take a look at it and let them know this is exactly what we talked about. This is great. You can submit it, or this isn't quite what we talked about. Maybe add this, change that. So again, that goes back to the point about relationships and really just, you know, asking what you need. If you ask that question of me, you know, or someone else at the foundation, they may say no, but I think it's always worth asking.
Okay, great. I have two questions that I'm going to combine. They're very similar. It's about newly created nonprofits and what funding opportunities exist for them. So first, kind of either with your organizations or if you guys know about specific opportunities for that new nonprofit that has not just, they don't have 2 years of audited financials, but a very limited history with their program work. You know, they know what they want to do, but they don't have the metrics yet. And I guess the tie into that, if I'm coming to you and I have my program that's 8 months or 16 months in, is there a minimum metric for, you know, my outcomes that you guys require there?
So I think that the Goldsecker Foundation has an excellent opportunity, and they have management assistant grants. They range, I think, as much as $25,000. And when I was director of an organization, I got one for a strategic plan. And so I think just going to the Goldsecker Foundation for the management assistance grants for startup organizations would help. I think for us, before we go deep with an organization, we kind of want to understand them a little bit. And so I think there should be expectations of a newly formed organization in terms of the amount of money. With Casey, what we would probably do is start off with a capacity building grant for you that would focus on general ops, so maybe a $15,000, $20,000 to assist you, but then get to know you better. And then I think once your core competencies are good and you have staffing, then we can kind of go to larger opportunities. But I think the first for us would focus on capacity and building up your infrastructure.
Yeah, the one thing I would add on that is there was a question about data and what's the minimum number of outcomes. I guess if you've been operating just for maybe under a year or something like that, I would say for whether you're operating for just a couple of months or multiple years, for most cases, when it comes to outcomes or things that we would look at, it's really on you to tell us what you measure and how you're measuring that. We can give you guidance in terms of how that lines up with other programs, but we don't say, and Janelle, I'm curious if Summer Funding Collaborative does this, but we don't say like for a summer program that you have to show that the students, you know, increase their grades by 10 percentage points. Like we don't have like hard things like that. The only place where we have that is for jobs programs, workforce development programs, where we look at actual wage data over years. But for everything else, you know, if you're a food program, an after-school program, or whatever you are, like, we're looking for you to tell us, this is what we measure, this is how we measure it, and this is what we've seen. We don't have like minimum thresholds. We don't have like a bright line, so to speak.
And I would,
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Natasha.
no, that's okay. I was just going to say, I was going to echo the same thing. And for us, we do have other funding sources outside of our Truist Foundation. So for Truist, the best thing to do is to have a conversation with someone like myself, and we can walk you through the process of understanding what our pillars are, and we would understand what your needs are. And then hopefully within a year, we can then provide you, or probably 13 months, we could provide you with some funding, but it may not come from the Truist Foundation. It may come from our Community Development Fund. But I would say the main thing is to have a conversation. And what Darius said was correct. We don't basically tell you what your outcome should be. You would tell us what that would be. And we would assess it based on your application submission.
So for the Summer Funding Collaborative, we don't have prescribed, metrics that we ask people to use. We suggest some if folks are, sort of new, or they're trying to revise theirs. There are some that we could suggest, but we just ask for the applicants as a part of their application to submit three goals or metrics that they're planning to track. We offer the SMART goals template as a way for them to do that. I actually think Nicole's presentation is really good. The guidance in there, especially about how you demonstrate how the better off component of what you're tracking, like how are the people that you're working with better off as a result of the intervention or service you've provided. Those are some of the most powerful some of the most powerful data that you can share in support of your program. But yes, and also I think the Youth Fund did a lot of technical assistance during the application process around this piece. I'm not sure if they have that information available up on their website, but if you're a part of that process, I would look back to the TA that they provided, because I found it to be really effective.
Yeah, Anika, I would just add a couple things. In that startup phase, the track record of the founder is actually really important. And so if the founder has done some work that aligns with the nonprofit organization that they're launching, that to be able to tell the story of how you're leveraging what you've experienced, whether you're a teacher and you've had a track record in the classroom, or you volunteered in the community with a particular organization and you have a track record there, that becomes part of the data and the story as well. And that mini grants often have, and community grants often have a lower threshold for both evaluation, as well as you can have a fiscal agent and the kind of financial information and infrastructure that you need to have. Mini grants and community grants often have a lower threshold. So that may be a place to start, and to use those funds, not necessarily to launch your full model, your full organization, but to maybe do a pilot or identify a set of work that you can do over a month or 3 months or 6 months, and to evaluate that and use the data from that pilot to then leap into a conversation and a relationship with the donor to say, hey, this is what I did, this is how much it cost me, this was the impact, and I want to take it on a much larger scale.
So
can you help me do that?
Thank you. You touched on something that is in our next question. You mentioned a fiscal sponsor. And one of our questions is, what happens when you get denied and the reason is your fiscal agent does not meet the standards of the organization? So again, with a lot of new nonprofits coming in with the fiscal sponsor to help you, you're in the process of getting your 501c3 approved, et cetera. You need that person that you think is giving you an advantage in the application game, and then you find out that you're missing out on funding opportunities because of them, which this is new to me and I've been doing this for years. So how do I vet my fiscal sponsor maybe a little bit better? And then, Talib and Derry, like, how often do you see that, that they become a deciding factor?
Nicole, do you want to start?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, it's the fiscal sponsor, the fiscal agent. I'm sorry. Let me say I'm professional and on point. So a couple of things. One is I think this is also a chance for you to learn from the funder, right? And learn from the folks that you're trying to seek funding from. They have guidelines for the financial information, the track record they're expecting from an organization. And so that then becomes the standard that you want to compare any potential fiscal sponsor or fiscal agent to. Have they been in existence 3 to 5 years? Do they have a budget of an appropriate size? Have they fiscal sponsored before? And what organizations have they served as fiscal agent or fiscal sponsor? And can you go talk to those organizations or the executive directors or program leads from those groups and find out, like, what was your experience? I think one of the things that people assume with fiscal agents, and this can vary, some are better than others, is that they're going to take care of you financially, right? Like they're going to take in your dollars and they're going to manage it well, and that you could be hands off on finance, you can be hands off on HR and other administrative roles and duties. And in actuality, you can't be hands on. You have to be paying attention to all of those things. So if you could think like a donor when you approach a fiscal agent, I think that'll go a long way to helping you troubleshoot whether this fiscal agent is the right one for you, and if they're really gonna manage your funds and hold you as they would themselves, right? So if they're not effectively managing their own organization, they're not gonna effectively manage your resources. So you wanna make sure you maintain that standard.
Yeah, my advice is to be very selective when you are selecting a fiscal sponsor to work with. For Weinberg Foundation, we accept requests from organizations that are using a fiscal sponsor, but the budget and financial information that we would be reviewing and basing our decision on would be for the fiscal sponsor. So what you want to make sure is that you are with the fiscal sponsor that has all the information, so that has audits, that those audits are fine. That they, like Nicole said, I would ask to speak with organizations that they have worked with before. I would also talk to other funders that you're in conversations with. If you're talking to me or to Talib or whoever and say, hey, we're considering different fiscal sponsors. Do you have a recommendation? What do you think about this? Those sorts of things. I think often we are eager to just, like Nicole said, we're eager to think of it as something we can just pass off a responsibility to a fiscal sponsor. But really, you should be very, very selective, because we do base our decisions on the fiscal sponsor, not just the program. So there may be instances where we want to support a program because it's great, but the fiscal sponsor may not be quite there.
So I'm going to jump in here, Anike, for a moment, in terms just to say the fiscal sponsorship is a challenge arena in the Baltimore market right now. And there are several, and then there are even more smaller ones popping up, but as well as this is a conversation I know that the Maryland Philanthropy Network, formerly ABAG, in terms of from a funder setting, is looking at as a collective in terms of what can we do. Even Maryland Philanthropy Network serves as a fiscal sponsor in a very limited way. There are other organizations that do. I think it's because it's a need in Baltimore and it's growing. I think that more answers will come available over the coming year. And I think COVID-19 has really blown this up as a need that we've all got to pay attention to. So I do think it's continued to grow in terms of, but certainly the points that both panelists made is critical, is that you can't hand over. You can never hand over your organization, your program. That should be opportunity, even with the best of fiscal funds, to learn, because in terms of that, you need that knowledge, you need those skills yourself, and you can't just hand that over. So I think that's going to be a continued growing arena here, and I will post to our fund and post to our website. They're actually kind of organizations from a collective standpoint that focus on fiscal sponsorship, because there's an actual nationally. And so there's some pointers on that website that I'll find that website and post that also helps you understand what questions you should be asking. There are fiscal sponsorship models in other parts of the country that are great. And so I always say look there as well to learn in terms of what really works best. But all the points that are made are really critical points. One other point I would add about fiscal sponsorship, though, and even as you think about your organization and your organization's growth, and whether or not you want to move to becoming a nonprofit or you're not yet there, I want to also put a plug in at this moment about ABC's board pipeline in terms of we actually train persons of color, largely African Americans, to become board members for nonprofits in this region, both in terms of it's not limited to Black-led nonprofits. The goal is to put more people, Black folks in our training includes the whole issue around equity, but includes reading financials in terms of what the challenges are for nonprofits. The goal of this is to make sure your governance model is also strong. And so that's part of it, and that governance model has people of color that have an equity framework. All that's a part of growing and making sure Black-led organizations get a chance, and Black residents, Black community members that are served often by white-led organizations. So our board pipeline is a tool that I would also urge people to pay attention to in terms of connecting with a number of those persons that have been trained to come onto your board, or those that are interested to go through the board pipeline training. Thanks, Anike.
Okay, thank you, Diane. Talib, I wanted to come to you. I didn't know if you had an answer to the previous question, but also really quickly, I'm going to give you two other questions that people asked specifically of you, which was to just provide clarity on the Mentoring Mentors program that you mentioned. I just need the exact name so I could let people know. And you also mentioned the Economic Opportunity RFP, and people wanted to know where to find that.
Okay. I think for the fiscal sponsorship question, I think everybody nailed it. It's a challenge, and you should take that decision very, very seriously. The name of the mentoring organization is called Mentoring Mentors. The executive director of that is Alfonso Mayo. And so that's Mentoring Mentors, Alfonso Mayo. And our Economic Opportunity RFP will probably come out in September. Sarah Mumford is our program manager, program officer for Economic Opportunity, but the RFP will come out in September.
Okay, great.
And what I'll do is I will forward that to ABC, so ABC will be able to distribute that to your networks.
Okay, and I just wanted to point out, I think people had either asked in the questions or chat, and I think it was answered, so I'll just let the whole audience know. Someone asked if you could apply for the Greater Baltimore COVID Response Fund grant if you have under 2 years of fiscal, and the answer was yes, you can use a fiscal sponsor. So again, take that answer with everything else that our panelists have shared when choosing your sponsor. And another question was about the management assistant grant that Talib mentioned through Gold Sector. And I believe if you go to the chat, I think Darius put up the exact link to reach that. And we are closing in. So I have another question that I will send to Diane, and then that will lead to her wrap up and then closing statements for everyone. Someone asked about ABC's 10 Essential Questions for Philanthropy, which is a new tool in our series of 10 Essential Questions tools that ABC has created. One, it is, we will send a link so that people can go to our website and see that. Of course, you can go to our website and click on the 10 Essential Questions page to see all of our tools. But Diane, we wanted to throw that back to you and ask if you can tie that into this whole conversation for everyone. Explain, intro our tool, and then tie it together for us.
Thank you, Anike. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I just want to, as I close out this morning, and before I answer that question, I want to also just look around and say thank you to every one of you in terms of the panelists for being this morning, in terms of giving of your time and your energy in terms of both preparing the webinar, just going through this in terms of we had a rehearsal and screening time. That I know this is important to every one of you, because I know each one of you, and I know how important this city is to every one of you, and this agenda is. And so thank you so much for your time, and particularly thank you in terms of Digital Harbor Foundation in terms of Andrew and Kenny, in terms of their donating their time today for us, so they serve as one of our sponsors in terms of making today happen in such a seamless way. COVID-19, again, repeat, which is really the obvious for all of us. It's really scary in terms of the time we're in right now. In other ways, it's also pushed all of us to do things differently and to focus on what we, again, have talked about for long and we know is real in terms of the issue of structural racism is real. The issue of the challenges for Black people in this country is real in terms of you can't look at all of the things that are happening that have surfaced up as a result of COVID-19, not just the health, but almost the business, almost every single category. That underlying issue is now pretty evident for the world to see. And a part of that evidence for the world to see that we've been pushing is how do we help systems and institutions begin to shift and change their organizations, their culture, their systems? How do we help them? That it really is about influencing and moving that to a different direction. That's going to take time, and we're pushing hard, and we need you all to join in some of that pushing. It's going to take time. The goal for us today is where we knew there was, in fact, funding that was available, that even where there are challenges, we want at least you have that opportunity. As I indicated, I put on the screen where there is an opportunity of Black-led groups doing micro grants for Black-led nonprofits, which is an amazing opportunity of investing and then making that grant stuff. All that's important as we move this agenda forward. And again, but part of that helping, one of the things that we do in terms of helping systems and organizations uncover and understand that they're not yet at a point of equity. So how do we give you some questions to help you begin to analyze that for your own organization? That's what the latest tool that was developed by Adara Yara and our team does in terms of with lots of help from people in philanthropy, including board members in terms of John Brothers from T. Rowe Price, in terms of a number of members in terms of Wells Fargo, in terms of that Monica Mitchell, in terms of Danielle Terrain. It really is how do we help lift up those questions in terms of that are critical for organizations to look at where they are not have a framework of equity. And how you know you don't is really your outcome in terms of that. And that's a part of making sure data is out there. That tool, along with the other 10 essential questions for racial equity, whether it's workforce, public policy, whether it's for employers, those are available on our website. So I urge you to go to our website. And so somebody asked the questions, I wrap up also around the board pipeline that I mentioned. And there's actually someone who talked about wanting to, that it was needed in Prince George's County. So I'm going to get a shout out and thank you for the folks that have come on the webinar from Prince George's County. And to this time we're in now, in terms of having propelled ourselves to do business differently and now being able to go online, in terms of some way that's a positive. It came out of a very, very negative environment right now. We took our board pipeline to online platform session. We'll do another session. We'll look at whether we can, in fact, extend. We actually began our board pipeline with people driving from Prince George's County because we knew there was such a need there. Again, it's also about resources for us. And our focus here in Baltimore is our core focus. So it will be about resources in terms of whether we have the resources to expand ourselves that way with an online platform. So I won't make any commitments because the reality is about resources for everyone and staying on mission in terms of moving that forward. But the mission for us is about the closing the racial wealth gap. And we're clear that all the programming, all the services are critical and important that we're doing right now, getting those services to our community, our lifeline, making sure people get reconnected to employment opportunities, making sure people, but also so that we're talking about sustainable and changing the future, we really got to begin to look at how do we change the systems? How do we dismantle structural racism? There's no two ways around this. It is both. It is not either or, it is both. And that is the work that we do. And that is about the work that we do. And we want to, again, thank you all in terms of for joining us. I again want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors in terms of both in terms of Nicole giving of your time and your own business in terms of this today, in terms of thank you, Baltimore's Promise, thank you, Sun Trust, and now Truist, in terms of giving of your time this morning, but also in terms of our indicated Digital Harbor donated their time, in terms of that, as well as I named, because I'm punting here in terms of, because I can't pronounce the Black-led organization. That's actually Jamie Karen, who's really doing phenomenal work in terms of, again, I'll make sure that website is available for all those that are in part of the audience. And this will be a part of that. But again, on our panel yesterday that was for Black-led businesses in terms of and getting the relationship and that information. One of the things that one of the panelists said that I want to repeat and say to Connie from AEO that I'm using her statement to share as I close out today, that one of the things that I'm real clear about is that what we do know is that Black people are resilient in terms of that, and we have been in terms of that is our history in terms of, and we will be resilient in this time as well. And so that I know that as we continue to meet these challenges and meet the challenges to those that are touching community and directly being a part of touching that community and making that difference, I know that we will continue to move forward. And again, I repeat, I think that we are part of that solution for ourselves. But I believe that we will together can move this forward in terms of moving for a different time after post-COVID-19 and getting through this in terms of, in a way that we will be resilient in terms of a positive. So I ask you to again thank our panelists for joining us this morning. We will be doing additional webinars. I know we have another one coming up in June in terms of around Black workers, in terms of that whole environment in terms of for Black workers. We'll continue to do more of these in terms of our goal, and we understand that information is gold, and we want to bring you gold. And so again, thank you all this morning for joining us. Have a good day. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.